Okay. So, so we sit quiet for a little while, so get our attention inside. Can focus on the breath, for example. Forget the past, forget worries about the future. We can remember our precious human rebirth, that it's so special to be alive at this moment, and that we have this circumstance. We have Dharma brothers, sisters. That we can make progress in our spiritual evolution to become Buddha for the benefit of all. It's not special that we have all these conditions which we have in our life. Are you willing to introduce yourself a little bit? I don't know what you want to say about yourself, but
I can do that.
Anyway, if I may say something, Sangye Khadro is very, very inspiring for me because she wrote this book, How to Meditate. Sangye Khadro was here nun in the 80s or so in this area. So she's already very long time nun, maybe 40, a little bit more, 40 years, so around 40 years.
I just had my 49th.
49 years. So it's really amazing. So I found this book about meditation, the Lamrim meditations, very, very helpful, especially in the beginning before I was monk at that time. Yeah.
Okay, so hi everyone, and I want to say congratulations to those of you who just got ordained a few days ago, I believe, with Chado Rinpoche. So in the past, I had the good fortune to receive teachings and some initiations from Chado Rinpoche, because I think it was in the early 2000s. I was spending quite a bit of time in India at Tushita and at Root Institute Dharamsala, teaching introductory courses. They have like every month these 10-day courses. And sometimes we would invite Chado Rinpoche to come and give some talks or give an initiation. And as he was living in Dharamsala as the abbot of Namgyal Monastery. And so it was always a wonderful experience to have him come. His energy is just so wonderful. So you're very fortunate. He's really an excellent teacher, excellent Lama. So now you have him as your abbot. So you're very, very fortunate. Venerable Tendar asked me to give a talk about how to stay ordained. And I guess he considers that my monastic life was a sort of success story because I've managed to stay ordained so many years now. And I don't know about nowadays, but in the past, in the early days, there were many Western people who got ordained and then disrobed. In fact, I got ordained at Kopan Monastery, Nepal in 1974 and stayed there for a couple of years. We had a small community of, I guess it wasn't that small. Sometimes we were up to 20 people, Western people who were ordained and living together and following the guidance of Lama Yeshe and Lama Zopa Rinpoche and doing daily activities together. And so of those people, that group of people, that was my Sangha community in those early days, the vast majority disrobed. I think there were only 3 or 4 of us who remained ordained. And so that was my experience over the first 10 or 20 years, that a lot of my Sangha brothers and sisters didn't continue being Sangha, being monastic. And it was quite disheartening at first. I was really quite shocked. And I guess after a while I got used to it and then it was more like surprising and, a joyful surprise when someone didn't disrobe and they remained ordained for many years. So I hope this doesn't sound discouraging to those of you who just got ordained, but I guess that you're aware of that. You've probably all met ex monks and ex nuns and know that that is something that happens. And so, yeah, so the last couple of days I've been kind of brainstorming just with my own brain, my own mind, um, trying to think of what I could say about this topic. And I managed to come up with quite a few points. I'm not an expert on Vinaya, so please don't think I know everything there is to know about Vinaya, but I do value it very much. I do try to understand it as well as I can. And being able to stay ordained isn't just a question of knowing Vinaya, but there are other factors as well. So I'll share with you some things that I have found helpful. And I also want to be honest that it hasn't been easy for me to stay ordained. There were a couple of times when I thought about giving it up, but I managed to avoid following those thoughts and continue being ordained, which I'm very happy about. And I really do have confidence that by now I will remain ordained until the end of my life. And that's a really good aspiration to have. Um, and also, I've messed up a lot. I've been like perfect and pure all these years. I've done some things that I feel very sorry about, that I regret. But that's normal. Yeah. We're human beings, we're not enlightened beings. And the whole point of taking vows and becoming ordained is to train ourselves, to work on ourselves and try to improve ourselves and live a virtuous life, an ethical life, and just do the best we can. But it's inevitable that we make mistakes, but those are opportunities to learn and grow and keep going. So I'll share with you some ideas that I have, and then I'll leave time for you to ask questions. So one reason that people do not remain ordained is because they break one of the four main vows. So in the case of fully ordained monks, these are called defeats. And in the case of fully ordained nuns, bhikshunis, we have actually 8 defeats. So there are 8 vows that we have to really take care of, because if we break one of those, then we're finished. Our ordination is finished. We can't continue being ordained. And in the case of novices, Getzels, they also have 4, but they're not really called defeats. They're called Hangdra, which means similar to defeat. And they are similar in that if you break one of those, then you're finished. So we really have to take care of those, cherish those. And but yeah, sometimes it happens that a monastic will break one of those. So the 4 are killing a human being, committing sexual activity, engaging in sexual activity, stealing something of value, and lying about realization, spiritual attainments. So if you do one of those in a complete way, then you lose your vows. And I haven't heard of anybody who lost their vows because of killing a human being, committing a murder. I mean, it could happen, but I just haven't heard of anyone. But I did hear about 2 people, one monk and one nun, who lost their vows because of the vow of sexual activity. And they did this separately, not together. There were 2 separate cases of this. And in both cases, they broke their vow because they didn't understand. They didn't have a correct understanding of how to keep that vow and how it is broken. And so in the past, and I hope it's no longer the case nowadays, but in the past, there were a couple of publications that explained the Getzel vows. And with regard to that particular vow of sexual activity, it said that the vow is, the breaking of the vow is complete if you have orgasm. So in order to completely break the vow, you need to have orgasm. And this is a mistranslation. This is a translation error. Because the Tibetan term dewa can mean just pleasure, simple pleasure, or it can also mean bliss, as in Tantra. We talk about bliss and emptiness, so it's the same word. And it seems that some translators thought that this word dewa should be translated as orgasm. It meant orgasm. And so that meant that if you have experience of orgasm, you completely break the vow. But if you don't break the vow. And so these two people had the idea that they could engage in sexual activity, and as long as they didn't experience orgasm, then it was okay. They didn't break their vows. So that was their thought, and that's what they did. They engaged in sexual activity. So this one nun had a boyfriend, and she was having sex with her boyfriend, but just stopping before having orgasm. And so then they found out that they were wrong, that was incorrect. Their understanding was incorrect. And so, but by that time it was too late. They had already broken their vow. They already lost their opportunity to continue being monastics. And so this shows how important it is to have a proper understanding, a good understanding of the vows that we have and what constitutes keeping those vows, what constitutes breaking those vows. And I've heard that in the Chinese tradition, when somebody becomes ordained, they spend, I think it's 5 years, the first 5 years of their life as a monastic studying their vows. And that doesn't seem to be the case in the Tibetan tradition. There doesn't, well, at least in my experience, I haven't encountered that there's that much emphasis on studying the vows. We might get some teachings on the vows, very sort of brief, but then we go on to study other things. And one reason for this might be because in the Tibetan tradition, many monks and nuns start off as little kids, sometimes only 5 or 6 years old when they first enter the monastery. And at that time, they're too young. They don't even actually take Getzel vows at that time. I think they take them later. But, they're too young to really study the vows and understand the vows. So usually in the monastic tradition, the Gelug tradition anyway, the vows are studied much later, kind of at the end of the Geshe studies. They spend something like 15 years studying other things, and then they study Vinaya. And there's even a quotation of one monk who said, "Oh, when I had my vows, I didn't know them, and now that I know my vows, I don't have them." So I think he meant, he hadn't studied his vows, and by the time he did study them, he'd already broken them. So maybe that's something we need to change, because most of us non-Tibetans, when we get ordained, we're already adults. Most of us are adults, and so there's really no reason why we shouldn't really study well and deeply the vows. And even before, there's also this tradition in the Tibetan tradition they have this idea that you can't know what the vows are until you take them, which I think many of us think is not really reasonable, because we need to understand what we're getting ourselves in for. Yeah. And in some traditions, it is allowed. It is even recommended that you know the vows before you take them. So I think that's good. Especially if for someone who's seriously considering it isn't that we want to advertise them and make them available for anybody to know, but someone who's seriously thinking of getting ordained, it's good for them to know the vows so that they have an understanding of what they're committing themselves to. So, like here at Sravasti Abbey, the procedure here is that if somebody is interested in getting ordained, they first come for some basic courses and just see what the lifestyle is like here. And then they can come and stay for a longer period of time and be a volunteer and participate in the program. And then if they're really serious, they request to take anagarka, which is, I don't know how to translate that, but it's kind of a step towards ordination. You shave your head, you take 8 precepts, not necessarily for life. It's more like a trial period where you can try out monasticism. And they don't wear robes like we do. They have more like a Chinese pajama outfit. And they live in the community, participate in all the activities. And so they get a good taste of monastic life. And they usually do that for a year or more, depends on the person. And then if they really want to take ordination, then they request that. So there's kind of a step-by-step process before the step of actually getting ordained and starting to wear these robes. And I think that's quite a good approach rather than just jumping into it, like with not a whole lot of understanding, which is my experience. That's what happened with me. I was very young and impulsive. Yeah, so anyway, the point I'm trying to make here is that it's very important to have a good understanding of the vows. And nowadays it's good. There are a number of commentaries, like last year, Geshe Jamagelek at Lama Tsongkhapa Institute gave a very extensive teachings on the vows, and there've been other teachings as well, really going into depth and detail. So when I got ordained, that didn't exist. We just had this one little publication that listed the 36 vows with very little explanation. And there were no senior monastics when I got ordained. An older nun had been ordained maybe 2 years, 3 years. So she was like the senior nun. But yeah, it was like very new territory, getting ordained in those days. So things are much better now. There are many Western people who've been ordained for years, for decades. There's a lot more information available. And so, yeah, but we still have to make the effort to study the vows. And, if there's something unclear, ask questions. So really make sure you understand what the vows are, how to keep them, how to avoid breaking them, and so on. I also heard of another monastic who broke the vow of stealing. I don't know the details, but I think it was something to do with transporting goods from one country to another and not paying fees, customs fees or duties or something that should have been paid. And so that monk lost his vows due to that. I also heard of one nun who was arrested for smuggling drugs. I don't know the details of that, but it's possible that somebody slipped the drugs into her luggage and she didn't know that they were there. But anyway, those are some cases of Western people that I've heard of who lost their vows because of not knowing properly how to keep them and how to avoid breaking them. And it's also important to study the Lamrim and other basic Buddhist teachings so that we have a really good understanding of why we do this in the first place, why we become ordained, what are the reasons, what is the right motivation. So the basic motivation is, of course, renunciation, a good understanding of samsara. this circle of suffering, death, and rebirth that we are stuck in, that we have been stuck in from beginningless time. And what are the causes of that? Basically, ignorance, greed, hatred, other delusions or afflictive states of mind, especially attachment. Attachment is one of the main delusions that keep us stuck in samsara. And living as an ordained person is the best situation for overcoming attachment and the other delusions, because we have more time to study and practice, and keeping vows just naturally stops us from engaging in a lot of the activities that are motivated by attachment and aversion and so on and so forth. So it's like we're kind of putting this fence around ourselves to protect ourselves from creating non-virtue and creating the causes for more samsara. So it's quite important to have that understanding of what is the reason, what is the purpose of taking ordination, keeping vows. And not have a misunderstanding, not think of ordination and keeping of vows as restrictive and restricting our freedom and putting ourselves in a miserable situation so we can't really be happy, we can't enjoy life. So these kind of thoughts can creep up in our mind, and it could, it's probably what a lot of lay people think, all those poor monks and nuns, they can't enjoy life, they can't be happy, they can't have fun. So, especially if we have family members or friends from before we got ordained who say that kind of thing to us, then, it could influence our mind to start thinking that way as well. And then we might start thinking of the vows as chains, and monastic community is like a prison. So be careful about those kinds of thoughts. If you have any of those thoughts coming up in your mind, recognize that those are invalid. Those are not valid cognitions. Those are incorrect thoughts, and they rise because of past experiences, both in this life and in past lives, and also possibly the influence of other people. And you don't have to follow those thoughts. You don't have to go down that road. So work on those thoughts, overcome them. If you have any difficulty doing that, seek help. Talk to senior monastics, teachers, and so on. So that actually happened to me. I was only 22 when I got ordained. I was still pretty young and kind of naive about a lot of things and very idealistic. I thought it was going to be so easy because there was all this talk about attaining enlightenment in one lifetime. And I thought, sure, that's what I'm going to do. It was only many years later, I heard the Dalai Lama say, actually, maybe one person out of a million is able to attain enlightenment in one lifetime, but most of us, it will take much longer than that. And so I was kind of relieved because by that time I had already been practicing for many years and I felt like I hadn't gotten very far. So it was kind of discouraging. But back in the early days, again, we didn't have that much. There were very few Dharma books and very few Western people who had been learning and practicing Dharma for a number of years. And so we were all pretty new and didn't have access to a more realistic presentation of the Dharma. So I think many of us fell under that kind of illusion, thinking that enlightenment was easy. We could attain it in, a couple of years. Yeah, they say 3 years, you're going to attain enlightenment in 3 years. So, yeah. So anyway, yeah, so I was quite young. And then some years later, I was living in a Dharma center in the West. And it was like a big community. There were quite a few monastics there, but also a lot of lay people. And I was still pretty young. I was still in my 20s at that time and studying. My reason for being there was to study. But I found myself starting to think, well, maybe I rushed into this too quickly, and maybe it would be good for me to have a relationship with someone and learn how to love somebody. That's something I'd never really done before. And so maybe I can't be a fully matured person if I don't know how to love somebody. So these kind of thoughts were coming up in my mind, perhaps because there was a lot of that going on around me. Most of us were very young, and the lay people were getting in and out of relationships with each other. So I started having those kind of thoughts of giving back my robes and having a relationship. But fortunately, there wasn't anyone I was actually interested in having a relationship with. It wasn't like I was in love with somebody. It was just this idea in my mind, this sort of fantasy in my mind. And I did talk to people. I talked to some of my teachers who were definitely against the idea and really encouraged me how valuable it was to keep vows and so on. And even some of my lay friends, I talked to a couple of lay women who I was friends with, and I told them I was thinking of disrobing, and they said, "Oh no, no, don't do it, don't do it. You're much better off as a nun," which kind of surprised me because I thought, well, so why aren't you a nun if you think it's not a good idea? Well, maybe they were already involved in relationships, and some of them already had kids, so it was kind of too late for them to change that. So nobody was encouraging me, and of the people that I spoke to, nobody gave me encouragement um, to give up. And so in the end, I gave up the idea, decided to keep going because it really was just a fantasy. Um, High in the sky, we say in America, something that, yeah, rabbit's horns or um, flowers growing in the sky, something non existent, thinking I would be happier if I wasn't ordained. And I also remember sometimes Lama Yeshe and Lama Zopa would say that. They say that, um, of the Western people they knew who got, who were ordained and then gave it up, they weren't happy. None of them were really happy afterwards. So anyway, I managed to get through that little crisis and continue being ordained. But we do have to be careful if we see those kind of thoughts creeping up in our mind. Just know that you do have a choice. You don't have to follow them. You don't have to believe in them. You can say, well, let me look at this carefully. Yeah, don't be impulsive, but think about it carefully, seek advice from others, and hopefully you will get the kind of advice that I did to, yeah, stay ordained and not give it up. That um, connects with another thing that's very, very important, very helpful to remain ordained, and that is the practice of mindfulness and introspection. If we break vows or give back vows, it doesn't just happen all of a sudden out of the blue with no causes and conditions, but it's always the result of a number of causes and conditions, and it may have been something that developed over time. And so if we have good mindfulness, then that will protect us. So there's different meanings of mindfulness. The word mindfulness can have different meanings. One meaning of mindfulness is keeping in mind. So, for example, we take vows and we need to keep in mind that we did take those vows. Remember the vows that we take and not forget them. Okay, remember that we've made this promise to not kill, to not steal, to not take alcohol, drugs, and so on. So keep those in mind without forgetting. After a while, you don't have to consciously bring them to mind. But in the beginning, it's probably good to read them every day, or at least a few times a week. Make a regular practice of reading your vows so that you really imprint them strongly in your mind and don't forget them. They don't slip out of your mind. And so that's one meaning of mindfulness. But another meaning of mindfulness is watching our mind, just being aware of the kind of thoughts and emotions that are coming up in our mind. And together with that is another mental factor of introspection, also called vigilance, introspective awareness. There's different terms for that, shishin in Tibetan. So that monitors our mind, so that we are able to recognize if certain thoughts are coming up that are unwholesome, unwise, unskillful, non-virtuous, things that could get us into trouble if we're not careful. So those two are really important. Mindfulness, remembering our vows, remembering what we should do and shouldn't do, keeping those in mind, not forgetting, and then watching our mind to notice the arisal of unwholesome thoughts, dangerous thoughts. And if we do notice any of those, we shouldn't, it doesn't have to feel ashamed. That's one problem I had. I would feel deeply ashamed. I had this kind of, again, unrealistic idea that I should be a perfect and pure nun, never have any negative thoughts and never make any mistakes. I should always do things perfectly. So I was kind of a perfectionist. So when negative thoughts would come up in my mind, then I would feel really, really ashamed of myself, guilty, and I would never tell anybody else what was going on in my mind, because then I thought, oh, what will they think of me? Maybe I'll be thrown out of the community if they know that I think this way. So that kind of attitude isn't helpful at all. And in fact, this is one of the things I really like about the community that I'm living in now, Sravasti Abbey. There's this sort of environment of transparency. So, for example, we do sojong every 2 weeks, although we use the Sanskrit term posada. So every 2 weeks we have posada. It's happening tomorrow, actually. And when we do posada here, we take precepts, 8 Mahayana precepts. And then before the posada ceremony, right at the beginning of it, we confess to each other what we have done in the last 2 weeks, which vows we have broken. And this is done in a very open way, in a very loving way. Nobody's judging anybody else. We're just sharing. I did this and I did that. And then we do the ceremony of posada. I have never been in a community before that did that, and I think it's so wonderful. It's so refreshing, that there is that complete openness, honesty, transparency, that we're telling each other about the vows that we have broken, and of course with regret, with genuine wish to purify those, not repeat them. And I just find that really helpful to just have that openness and honesty about our failings, our mistakes, our shortcomings, and knowing that I'm not the only one who made these mistakes. Other people made them as well. And so we can hold each other with compassion and kindness and forgiveness, without judging each other. And also, another thing that happens in the community is we take turns giving a talk before lunch, just a short 15-minute talk. And it's usually about some aspect of monastic life or some aspect of Dharma practice that we've been working on, that we've been struggling with. And so the other day, for example, someone gave a talk about jealousy and competitiveness, and just talking about how that was part of his life before becoming ordained. And then even after getting ordained, living in this community, he still finds that kind of thing coming up, jealousy and competitiveness. And he did it in a very humorous way. So everybody was laughing, and yeah, so it's really nice to have that kind of talk, and being able to laugh at ourselves for our human failings and mistakes and so on, instead of feeling ashamed and, oh, I have to hide this, and, oh, I'm so bad, and I bet nobody else is like this. So there's that atmosphere here of honesty and openness, and compassion and forgiveness for each other. So I find that really refreshing. It's for me a new experience. I haven't experienced it before in any of the other Dharma centers or monastic communities that I've been in, and I think it's very healthy. It's a very healthy way of doing things. Because, yeah, for one thing, it makes it easier for you, each person, to notice their own faults. When you hear somebody else talking about their jealousy and their competitiveness, then you can see, oh, yeah, I have that too. And yeah, I can see that it is a fault, it is a shortcoming, it's something I want to work on. So it helps you to become more mindful, more aware, more introspective about the things you need to work on and acknowledge them without feeling you have to hide them, pretend they're not there. And then another thing that's really important to be able to keep vows, continue living as a monastic is genuine respect for the Buddha, for the three jewels, for our teachers, for our vows, for our fellow monastics, especially those who've been ordained longer than us. So if we lack respect, if we have an attitude of disrespect or indifference, then that can lead us to be careless about our vows. Think, oh, they're not important. It doesn't matter. I can do this. Yeah. So actually, you may have heard this before the Buddha passed away. He was asked by one of the disciples, who will be your successor when you've passed away? And he said, the Vinaya. The Vinaya will be my successor, the precepts. So this, precepts are very important. The Vinaya is very, very important. That's the Buddha's chosen successor. In other words, this is what we need to understand and observe and live in our life. And so, if we don't have a good attitude of respect, proper respect for our precepts, we think, oh, and it's easy to happen because some of the precepts are challenging, and especially in this day and age, things are very different in the world now than they were at the time of the Buddha. Some of the precepts may seem outdated and irrelevant. But there are things we can do, adjustments that we can make, but that doesn't mean we have to throw them out, reject them, trash them, have a disrespectful attitude towards them. So it's good to, if we respect the Buddha, which we should, I think, if we're followers of the Buddha, then we should respect the Buddha. So if we respect the Buddha, then it's also important to respect the precepts and the Vinaya. So if we do happen to notice a lack of respect or even disrespect coming up in our mind towards the Buddha, towards the Dharma, towards the precepts, the Vinaya, towards senior monastics or fellow monastics, then it's important to not just let that pass or let that grow in our mind, but instead work with it. So what we can do to overcome a lack of respect is to consciously think about the good qualities of these objects, Buddha, Dharma, Sangha, other monastics, teachers, and so on. So really contemplate their good qualities, because it's easy to kind of ignore the good qualities or take them for granted and just focus on faults or things that we think are faults. They may not actually be faults, but things that we think are faults or shortcomings. Focus on those and blow them up out of proportion as if that's all there is, and there's nothing positive, nothing good there. So it's very easy for that to happen in the mind, and we need to try our best to not let that happen. And so to counteract that, we can just deliberately, consciously think about, meditate on, contemplate the good qualities of the Buddha, his teachings, the Sangha, and so on and so forth. and how, and also the benefits of keeping precepts. It's really good to contemplate that, how beneficial it is for ourselves, for our present life, to live an ethical life, and to be able to die without regret, with a more clear, peaceful mind, free of regrets. And then, of course, beyond this life, keeping our precepts as the cause for good rebirths in future lives, and then more long-term goals, nirvana, enlightenment, and so on. And also, keeping our precepts means we're upholding this important aspect of the Buddha's teachings. I mean, it's quite extraordinary when you think about it, that it's been more than 2,500 years since the Buddha began this monastic tradition. I think it's maybe the oldest in the world, maybe not. Jainism also has a monastic tradition, and I think that might have predated the Buddha by a short time. They were almost contemporaries. So, but those two, Jainism and Buddhism, have as far as I know, the oldest monastic traditions in the world. And it's extraordinary that it's survived all these years, 2,500 years. It's still alive in the present, which means we have the opportunity to take these vows and live this beautiful monastic life. And then if we maintain it, that means future generations. There's more and more people all the time coming through Buddhist monasteries wanting to get ordained. And so by ourselves upholding it, we're giving that opportunity for other people to take these vows and live a monastic life. So thinking in those ways can give ourselves energy and respect. Respect for the vows, respect for the Dharma, wanting to maintain it. Another thing I thought of is, because this is my own experience, problems that I've had, to be on the lookout for jealousy or resentment or criticalness that might arise in the mind towards other monastics who maybe take their precepts more seriously than oneself, keep them better than oneself. And so if those kinds of thoughts arise, if you look at another monastic and you see, oh, they're, really they're keeping their vows really well and really, really careful about what they do. And compared to them, maybe you're kind of sloppy, you're kind of careless and not keeping your vows very well, and maybe not wanting to keep your vows very well. So then these kind of attitudes might arise, feeling jealous of that person, feeling resentful, critical. So try to notice. Again, mindfulness is important, mindfulness and introspection. If those kinds of thoughts arise in the mind, then don't just follow them, give in to them, go along with them, but sit down and work on them. And ask yourself, why is this coming up in my mind? These are clearly delusions, afflictive emotions, and they're the cause of suffering. So what's going on there? Why are these coming up in my mind? And that will help you to understand how to work with them, how to deal with them. And hopefully you will recognize that, what lies behind those thoughts is other delusions and probably ignorance and self-centeredness, self-cherishing. Like maybe you think, oh, this person makes me look bad. I don't want to look bad. I want them to be as sloppy as I am about keeping their vows, and then I won't feel so bad about myself. So is that really a healthy attitude to have? So it doesn't mean you have to beat yourself up because you're not as good as that person. So that's something to avoid. That's definitely not a helpful attitude to have. Comparing. We do it. I think it's just a human trait. Maybe animals have it as well. It's just an automatic thing of comparing ourselves with others. I once heard one of my teachers, Rilpa Rinpoche, talk about this. And he said that, we just automatically compare ourselves with other people. And when we do, then one of three attitudes arises in our mind. If we determine I am better than that person, then we feel pride, arrogance. On the other hand, if we feel that person's better than me, then we feel jealous, envious. And if we determine the other person is kind of roughly equal to me, then we feel competitive. Like, okay, how can I prove that I'm better than them? How can I get one step ahead of them? Oh, maybe in class, when the teacher asks a question and I put up my hand and I give the answer and the teacher says, yes, you're right, then I can feel, okay, 1 point for me, I'm better than that person. So when I heard Ruba Rinpoche talk about this, I really felt, oh my God, it's true. But we all do it. I mean, the fact that he, a Tibetan of another generation, talked about this indicates that it's kind of universal. These are universal human traits. But it doesn't have to be like this. We can look out for these states of mind, these attitudes, and when we notice them in ourself, work on them. There's lots of antidotes in the Lamrim and the Lojong teachings, many, many, many tools, methods that we can use to transform negative attitudes rather than just following them. And in that way, we become a happier person, better able to get along with others. So now what I try to do is rejoice. If jealousy comes up in my mind because I think someone's better than me, doing better than me, I turn that around and turn it into rejoicing. I rejoice that that person is doing so well, is smarter than me, knows more than me, is a better teacher than me, is keeping their vows better than me. I rejoice. I'm happy. I think it's wonderful that they're doing that. It may not always come naturally, that feeling, but I kind of make myself think that way. And it's certainly much more pleasant and satisfying than jealousy, which is so painful. And if we rejoice in what others are doing, provided it is virtuous, it is, they do have good qualities, they are doing good things. So if we rejoice in that, we're creating merit. And that means we are going more in the direction that we want to be in. We're becoming more like that ourselves. So it's creating the causes for more success and more good qualities in the future. So it makes a lot more sense than jealousy, which is painful. Like in the immediate moment, right then and there, it's painful. It's a really painful state of mind to be in. And it's negative. So you're just creating more suffering for yourself, not more happiness, more good qualities. So it's just logical to have rejoicing rather than jealousy. And the same with any other delusions that come up in the mind. I think in most, if not all cases, where somebody breaks their vows or decides to give them back, give them up, I don't want to do this anymore. I think, I can't say for sure because I can't read people's minds, but I think in most cases it's because of delusions. It's not because of wisdom, it's not because of clear thinking, intelligent thinking, but it's some kind of delusion or multiple delusions that have come up in the mind, and the person just got caught up in those thoughts and didn't know how to deal with them or didn't want to deal with them and just followed them. And so it's very, again, mindfulness and introspection are very, very important qualities to develop. Watching our mind, being honest when we do notice some delusion, and not letting it proliferate, grow, not letting ourselves follow it, but instead looking for solutions, for antidotes, There are many antidotes, so you can try that on your own. And if you're struggling, if you aren't able to overcome that delusion on your own, talk to others, talk to teachers if you can, talk to senior monastics, talk to others, friends, Dharma friends, spiritual friends, to get help with working with your delusions. So that's, again, another important step to being able to stay ordained, working on the mind, overcoming the delusions. If we are overly reliant on just one person, like one of our teachers, and then if something happens to that teacher, for example, if they pass away, or if they get into some misbehavior, there's some kind of scandal. So if you have focused so much of your attention and so much of your reason for practicing Dharma and being a monastic on that person, then when that kind of thing happens, the whole thing may fall apart. Like you feel your world has collapsed and you may want to give up being ordained. You no longer have any enthusiasm, any interest, any motivation to continue being a monastic. Maybe even practicing Dharma, so your whole Dharma practice might fall apart. So yeah, just recently this happened with one person I know who'd been ordained many, many years. Very, very good monastic, very good teacher. But one of the teachers that she was close to, it seems, engaged in some very improper behavior and didn't admit it, in fact, denied it. And the organization, the people around that Lama tried to cover it up and pretend it didn't happen. And so this Western nun was very upset about that and decided to give back her robes. I don't fully understand all the reasons, but Venerable Children here, and she's the abbess of this community, she gave a talk about it and said that, yeah, when we become ordained, our ordination is with the Buddha. We are making the promise to keep these vows to the Buddha, not to an individual teacher and not to a, organization, the current present organization, but it's the Buddha. And so even if something happens to one of our teachers or to one of the organizations that we're connected with, that shouldn't disrupt our wish to continue being ordained. We can leave that teacher, we can leave that organization, but find another one that is suitable to us. And similarly, if a teacher passes away, as happened recently with our precious teacher, Lama Zopa Rinpoche, I don't know if any of the Western monastics felt so upset about that their wish to remain ordained fell apart. I hope not, because Rinpoche was very, very, very strong about encouraging us to keep our vows. And so to me, whether he's here or not, I want to continue keeping my vows. I feel that is the best way to repay his kindness and do what he wished, what he advised. But I don't know if everyone thinks that way. Maybe not everyone does. And I think it happened with Lama Yeshe. When Lama Yeshe passed away, that was in 1984. I think some people were so dependent on him, so reliant upon him, that when he was no longer there, then they lost their interest and continuing to practice and drifted off. Not sure what happened to them. So I can't say for sure that this would happen or does happen to anyone, but it's possible. And so I think I really agree with what um, Venerable Thupten Chodron said, that we need to have it very clear in our mind that the Buddha is the one we have promised our vows to. We promised to the Buddha, to the three jewels, to all the Buddhas and Bodhisattvas. We promised to them that we are keeping our vows. And so even if our temporal teachers, our present day current teachers, if they pass away or if they get disrobed, that's also a possibility. One of our teachers who's ordained might say, goodbye, I don't want to be ordained anymore. That does happen. It's important that we have the strong determination to keep going in spite of what our teachers do. So this, I'm not, of course, we need to have great respect for our teachers and regard them as really, really precious, but just to be careful about this possibility of some kind of change happening with any of our teachers. And also keep in mind that they're not going to be there forever. Spiritual teachers, even the Buddha himself passed away. And it will, of course, happen with our spiritual teachers as well. So we need to have a strong determination to keep going in our practice as they have advised us. And I wanted to share with you something that Chado Rinpoche said. I got this from Venerable Chantal. Maybe you've already heard it, so I apologize if I'm repeating something you've already heard. But back in the year 2000, Venerable Chantal had an interview with Chado Rinpoche in Dharamsala. And one of the questions she asked was, what are the circumstances in which one could give back their vows according to the Vinaya? So in other words, what does the Vinaya say about giving back your vows? Because it seems that some people have quite a casual attitude about this and think, oh yeah, I don't feel like being a nun anymore and a monk anymore. I can just give them back. So what Chado Rinpoche says is quite strong, but this is according to the Vinaya. Okay, it's not just something he invented. So what he said was that giving back the vows is only in extreme circumstances. When one's life is in danger, then you could give back your vows. For example, in case of famine or war, or if there's a dictatorial regime and you might be in danger of being killed if you're a monk or nun. I was just reading recently about Mongolia. And this is what happened in Mongolia in the late 1930s. There were a huge number of Buddhist monks. It was like more than half the male population of Mongolia were monks. And then Mongolia became communist. And communists are not pro-religious at all. They're very anti-religious. And in the late 1930s, Stalin, because Mongolia is right next to Russia, and they were very close to Russia during the time when they were communists. And Stalin had great influence over Mongolia. So in the late 1930s, Stalin engaged in all this they call purges, but that's kind of a nice word. It was basically just killing lots of people. More than 1 million people in Russia were killed, including a lot of religious people, including Christian Orthodox, Greek Orthodox, Russian Orthodox clergy, but also Buddhists. There were many Buddhist monks in Russia, in the areas like Buryatia, Kalmykia, Tuva. So those were traditionally Buddhist areas. So Buddhists in Russia were persecuted. And then Stalin sent some of his agents to Mongolia. And they carried out a lot of killings there. I think the number was something like 18,000. They're not sure exactly because the bodies were just dumped into a big open pit, and they haven't they haven't dug them all up yet. But they estimate between 17,000 18,000 monks were just shot in the back of their head and their bodies thrown into a big pit. And then those who didn't get shot went into hiding. They didn't want to die. So they took off their robes and went home and looked after the sheep and the horses until Mongolia became free again in early 90s. And then they were allowed to, come back out of hiding and put the robes on and become monks. And now Buddhism is flourishing, so it's wonderful. But that's just an example of what can happen in a country that, your life is in danger if you wear your robes. And similar in Tibet, many, many monks and nuns were killed just for being monks and nuns. So in those kind of cases, apparently, you could... Chadra Rinpoche says, if you're thinking that there's more benefit in living than in dying, one could give back one's vows. So in brief, when there's a circumstance that one can no longer keep the vows, then it is better to give them back. And he says, when we take vows, there are 5 certainties that we need to have. So you may have heard this during the ordination or as part of the teachings. So one is certainty of the branches, where you think I will keep all the vows, and not just think I'm going to keep some of them, but not others. I'm only going to keep some of them. So you should think I will keep all of them. And the second certainty is about the length of time, thinking I'm going to keep these vows until I die, and not just for a limited period of time. And third is the certainty of circumstances, meaning I will keep the vows even if it's difficult, even through hardships, even if I'm sick and so on, and not just think I'm going to keep the vows when I feel like it, when it suits me, when I'm happy. And then certainty about the place. You think I'm going to keep my vows no matter where I am, rather than I'll keep them when I'm in India, but not when I'm back in the West. I'll keep them when I'm in the monastery, but not when I go home. And then fifth is the certainty of sentient beings, where we think I will keep the vows in relation to all sentient beings and not just some, like my friends, but not with my enemies, in relation to all living beings. And then Chadra Rinpoche went on to say that, if we give back the vows, it's like telling a lie. Because when we take the vows, we promise, I'm going to keep these vows until I die. And with regard to these 5 certainties, so it's kind of going back on a promise that we made. So he said it's like a lie. And then secondly, another thing he says, which I think is quite important, he says, when you give back your vows, you're creating the cause for being in a place where the Sangha doesn't exist, a place devoid of Sangha. Because when you give back your vows, you're moving away from the Sangha. It's like there's a dislike for monasticism. You're saying, I don't like that. I don't like that kind of life. I don't like those kind of people. I want to get away from it. And so then in the future, like in future lives, it becomes difficult to meet the Sangha. So I thought that was quite powerful. If you think about our long-term goal, becoming a Buddha, freeing ourselves from suffering and its causes, and then developing our potential for enlightenment to help all other sentient beings be free of samsara, suffering and its causes, then it's really important that life after life, we continue meeting with the Buddha and the 3 jewels, which includes the Sangha. So, that's one of the important conditions for being able to continue on the path. I don't think this means, it's just horrible and the end of the world if you do give back your vows. Because there are people who give back their vows and they continue to be very strong Dharma practitioners and even teachers, and they have a great deal of respect for the Sangha. So I have seen that. So it doesn't mean that giving back your vows necessarily means you have aversion to the Sangha and you'll never be able to meet the Sangha again in the future. But I think he's just giving a warning there, just to be careful about your state of mind. And even if you do find yourself in circumstances where it does seem to be the best thing to give back the vows, and you talk about it with your teacher and your teacher agrees, then at least try to maintain that attitude of appreciation, respect, faith in the Sangha, and pray to be able to meet the Sangha again in all your future lives. And in fact, one of my teachers, Dhamma Rinpoche, once said that it's really good to make prayers regularly, that you'll be able to keep your vows and be a monastic in all future lives. There's actually a verse in the King of Prayers which says, remembering my past lives and all varieties of existence, may I practice the Bodhisattva way. And thus, in each cycle of death, migration, and birth, may I always abandon the householder's life. So, praying to, in all future lives, to be able to see the disadvantages of a householder's life, see the advantages of a monastic life, and make that choice, choose to live a monastic life. I think it is best if you really are serious about remaining monastic the rest of your life, try to live in a monastic community if possible, or at least live near one so that you are in contact with other monastics. I think it's quite difficult to live on your own, far away from other monastics, and be able to continue having the motivation to live this life, although it's not impossible. I know a couple of monastics who do live on their own, not close to any monastery or Dharma center, and they do well. They're able to remain monastic. So it's not impossible, but I know for myself, I find my mind is very different when I'm living in a place surrounded by lay people and no other monastics versus when I'm living with other monastics. I find a lot more energy, a lot more enthusiasm to keep my vows, to live a monastic life when there are others around me who have that same state of mind and that same lifestyle. It's also, I think, good to have regular discussions about the Vinaya and about vows. And like I mentioned before, to really talk openly and honestly about areas where you're having difficulty. You know, if you're having difficulty with any of the vows, or if you're having difficulty with certain mental states that are coming up in your mind, don't just hide those, keep them to yourself. Otherwise, there's the danger that they can grow and take over your mind, and then before you know it, you're finding yourself going in a very different direction, away from monasticism, away from Dharma. And that doesn't mean you have to tell everybody everything, but in the right environment with the right people in the right way, then that can be very, very helpful. Another thing I thought of is to be careful when it comes to gaining knowledge. Like, we have these wonderful study programs at Nalanda and Lama Tsongkhapa Institute and other centers in the FPMT, the basic program, the master's program, and then some monks go to the monasteries in South India, like Sarah, study to become yeshis. So it's wonderful to gain knowledge. I mean, it's so important that we have a good understanding of the Buddha's teachings. The Dalai Lama really emphasizes that we understand and analyze and, don't just be Buddhist with blind faith, but have your faith based on having thought about and analyzed properly the teachings. So it is important to study, but we also have to be careful. When I was doing the master's program in Italy, our teacher at that time, Geshe Tembel, he said, be careful when you start getting a lot of knowledge, that it's very easy for pride to come up in your mind. And it's true. You know more than other people. You can talk about things that other people can't talk about. You can show how much you know. It's very hard not to have pride and arrogance coming up when there's knowledge. And then, especially if you become a teacher, you actually have people sitting there looking at you, listening to you, and giving you feedback like, oh, thank you so much. That was so helpful. You're such a good teacher, and da 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 da. Yeah. So very easy for pride to come up, for ego to come up. So what can happen in addition to pride is getting this sort of inflated view of yourself, thinking, wow, it's true. I am so good. I am so smart. I am such a good teacher. I'm helping so many people. And then that can affect the way that we keep our vows and attitudes that we may have. So that maybe we don't keep our vows very carefully, but then we find reasons, we find justifications. Well, yeah, I'm not keeping them perfectly, but I'm doing what my teacher told me to do. My teacher told me to teach. So that's what I'm doing. And so, well, everything else I'm doing must be okay as well. Or I'm such a knowledgeable person. I know so much about Dharma. So everything I do must be correct, even though we're not really keeping our vows very well. So I'm saying this from experience. This is what happened in my mind. So it's important to be careful about that, and don't disregard the vows. Don't become careless and sloppy about the vows. Yeah, value them. And try to keep them to the best of your ability. I'll talk a little bit more in a bit about something, and again, something else Chado Rinpoche said about what it means to be a pure monk or nun. But just a little bit more about this. So another thing that can happen is getting really busy. So when you're involved in study programs, in teaching yourself, or just in Dharma centers and monastic communities and so on, you can get so busy that you don't have enough time to really look after your mind, what's going on in your mind. So I remember way back in the past, Lama Yeshe would say to us that we should do retreat every year. We should take some time off and do retreat. And I'm not sure if I always did that, but when I did have the time to do retreat, I found it very, very beneficial, because it was a time where I stopped all this busyness and just was there with myself and my mind. And naturally, all these memories would come up about things that I've been doing during the time before the retreat, since my previous retreat. And I'd see very clearly mistakes that I'd made and errors and inappropriate behavior. So then that gives you the chance to look at those, purify them, resolve to try to avoid doing those things again. So that's really important. I think in Nalanda they have you have a regular 3-month retreat in the summer. So it is important to not make yourself so busy that you don't have time to do that. Yeah. So I'm talking a lot about the importance of keeping vows well and purely, but at the same time, like I said at the beginning, we're just human beings. We're not enlightened beings, and naturally we have delusions in our mind, and nobody can be perfect. That's why we have to take vows and live this life. We're trying to become perfect, but we can't start off being perfect. And so I think it's good to have a balanced approach. On the one hand, do respect your vows, take them seriously, try to keep them to the best of your ability. On one hand, have that attitude, but on the other hand, don't have the attitude, I have to be perfect and pure and never make a mistake, such that you then get upset with yourself and beat yourself up whenever you do make a mistake. So in between those two, taking the vows seriously, but also accepting that you're a human being, an unenlightened being, and you will inevitably make mistakes. And it's not the end of the world, because we have, well, if you're in a place where sojong is done, then you have the chance to do that regularly, do sojong. And there's also daily practice of purification with 35 Buddhas, Vajrasattva, and so on. So there are remedies when we do make mistakes, things we can do to purify those. Chado Rinpoche, back in, I think it was 2004, we had a pre-ordination course in Tushita Dharamsala. He came and gave some teachings on the vows. I have some notes from that. And he sometimes used this expression, pure monk or pure nun. And so I asked him, what does that mean? What's the criteria for a pure monk or nun? So his answer, he said it can be explained in different ways. The least, meaning I think the bottom line, the minimum, is being pure with regard to the 4 root vows, the 4 defeats, or 4 similar to the defeats: not killing, not stealing, not having sexual misconduct, and not telling a lie about realization. So, having avoided committing any of those. And then when it comes to among the vows, I don't know how much you've studied the vows, but there's division of the vows into those that are naturally negative, naturally non-virtuous, like killing, stealing, and so on. And then those actions that are not naturally non-virtuous, but they were prescribed by the Buddha, or proscribed by the Buddha. For example, drinking alcohol. Drinking alcohol isn't naturally non-virtuous, but the Buddha made it a rule, made it a vow for monastics to avoid taking alcohol and intoxicants. So that's an example of something that isn't naturally non-virtuous, but it's still something we promise to avoid. So in addition to keeping the 4 root vows, not breaking those, trying one's best to refrain from those vows related to natural non-virtues, like killing an animal or telling lies, little white lies, and so on. So I felt quite relieved when I heard that, because you might get the idea a pure monk or a pure nun means you never break any of your vows. You always keep every single one of your vows perfectly and purely. That's not the case. So he explained that mainly it means refraining from those 4 root vows, those 4 actions, and then trying the best you can to avoid breaking the other vows, especially those that are naturally non-virtuous. And with regard to those that are prescribed, not naturally non-virtuous, but prescribed by the Buddha, with the exception of drinking alcohol, the others are such that we can ask permission. For example, eating at night. So eating at night isn't naturally non-virtuous. It's only for monks and nuns to refrain from. But it's still better to keep if we can. But there are people who need to eat at night. They have difficulty studying, practicing, meditating. They have health problems if they don't eat at night. With regard to that vow, instead of just having the attitude, oh, it's not important, I'm not going to keep that one, it's good to have the attitude of, it was a vow made by the Buddha, and I do wish to keep it. I will try to keep it when I can, but sometimes I do need to eat at night. And when we have that need to eat at night, then it's good to ask permission. We can do that just mentally in our mind, ask Buddha's permission to eat at night. There's also a verse that can be said in the morning. I mean, there's one for gelongs, for fully ordained monks, and a version of that was made for getzels, for novices. So I hope you have access to that. I can send it to anybody who doesn't. But that's a nice thing to do in the morning, just to remember which vows you've taken that you might not be able to keep during the day, and just asking permission from the Buddhas and Bodhisattvas to do those actions. So those are the main things that I've thought of. I have some other things that I can share with you, but I thought I should maybe pause and let you ask questions if anyone has a question.
I thought it was interesting what you said about how you perform sojong where you are. And I have some questions about that. I wondered if it's something you did from the start, or if not, how it came about. You decided to have this more honest and transparent approach to confessing negativities. And also, how many people is in your community, in your Sangha community now?
So you're asking, how did it begin, this practice of confessing to each other?
Yes.
I'm not sure, because I only joined this community a couple of years ago. It started it's been going 20 years. I think this year will be the 20th anniversary, although it took a while to grow. In the beginning, there was just one nun, Venerable children, and then gradually some students came and took ordination. So it's been very much a developing community. So and it was a while before they could even do sojong, because they had to wait until there were 4 fully ordained nuns to be able to do sojong. So I don't know how many years it was before they were able to actually do sojong. And then, I don't know if they did this open confession right from the beginning, or they decided to do it afterwards. I'd have to ask some of the older community members about that. I mean, it is something we're supposed to do. We are supposed to actually confess the transgressions that we've made over the last 2 weeks. And I once asked a geshe why they don't do that in the Tibetan tradition. And if I can remember correctly, the reason that he gave, he said that when you do this confession, when you're confessing vows that you have broken to another monastic, that monastic needs to be clear of that fault. In other words, let's say I want to confess that I was eating in the evening. So I need to find a monk or a monastic who hasn't been eating in the evening. So they are pure in that particular vow. And it's difficult to do that sometimes in a big monastery where they have thousands of monks. It's often difficult to find another monastic who's completely pure in all their vows. And so he said, so they had this they developed this tradition of just confessing to the whole assembly. Yeah, so there's this verse in the Sojong where you just go through all your vows and you say, I did this and I did this and I did this and I did this. It's just like, pre-written confession, and you just say all of that to the whole assembly. And then in that way, there's a greater chance that among that assembly, there will be at least one person who hasn't broken, the vow that you have. Something like that. I may have misunderstood what he said, but that kind of made sense in a way. But here, We don't have such a strict rule about that. Maybe because we're mainly following the Chinese tradition. Our Vinaya tradition is from China. It's the Dharmaguptaka tradition, and they do things not always in the same way as the Tibetans. So it could be that in the Chinese tradition, that is not a requirement, that you have to find someone who's pure in that particular vow to confess that you broke that vow. So we do it together in a group, to everybody, but it's not a large group. I mean, the number of fully ordained nuns is about, 10, 11, 12. I'm not always sure because people go away sometimes. Yeah, but it's relatively small. So we confess to each other the vows that we've broken, and whether it's strictly speaking totally correct according to the Vinaya, I don't know. I'm not in a position to say that. Vinaya is quite complicated, but the experience that I have is that it's very good. It's a very good thing to do that, rather than just reciting these words in the text. It doesn't have the same effect on me anyway. It just helps me to be more open and honest and transparent about my vows, and also understanding that many of the others have committed those mistakes as well, and so then I don't feel as guilty and alone and I'm the worst of all. And those are thoughts that I used to have.
So you mentioned that you follow the Chinese tradition. So my question is, that means that you do Sojong by Dharmagupta Vinaya.
Mm-hmm.
Does that mean that Mullah Sravasti Vadin cannot join? Or because sometimes in some traditions they say you cannot join if it is different Vinaya tradition.
Yeah. For nuns, there are no Mullah Sarvastivana bhikshunis, because that particular tradition died out. I don't think it ever came to Tibet. My understanding is, the Mullah Sarvastivada lineage for monks came to Tibet and flourished and is still existing, but the Vinaya, the vows for nuns never even came to Tibet. And I don't think there's anywhere in the world where there are any Mullah Sarvastivada bhikshunis. So that lineage is non-existent. So the only existent lineage for bhikshunis, for nuns, fully ordained nuns, is the Dharmaguptaka tradition, which went originally from India to Sri Lanka, and then Sri Lanka to China, and it remained in China for thousands of years, and also spread to Korea, Vietnam, Taiwan. And so that's the lineage we have, because it's the only one that exists if you want to be fully ordained nun. So for here, the bhikshunis, and when we do sojong, it's only the bhikshunis who get together and do sojong. We do have shramaneras, both male and female, and they are also ordained in the Dharmaguptaka tradition. But we do sometimes have visiting nuns who have the Mullah Sarvastivada vows, the Getzel vows, and they can join our sojong, no problem. So yeah, the Chinese are much more open about that. I think that there was some incident that came up recently. I can't remember the details, but it was somehow in the Tibetan tradition, they're much more strict about not mixing traditions. But the Chinese, and I guess the Theravada as well, are not as strict about that. And so, yeah. But actually, when I was in Lama Tsongkhapa Institute, when I lived there, they did sojong, and the geshis allowed me to attend the sojong with the monks, with the bhikshus. So even though I had a different Vinaya lineage, they said it was okay for me to join sojong. But I think one reason for that is, I mean, of course, it's better to do it within your own lineage, but there was no other option. Otherwise, I couldn't do sojong. So I was grateful that they allowed me. But see, when reciting the Pratimoksha Sutra, they would only recite the 4 root vows, the 4 defeats, and then they would just abbreviate the rest. And we have those in common. Okay, so I have those vows as well. From that point of view, you know, we didn't have there was no discrepancy between those vows. If they had recited the entire Bhikshu Pratimoksha, then it wouldn't have been appropriate for me to be there because I don't have many of those vows. So that was my way of thinking, that made it okay. So I guess Vinaya is complex, and it seemed to be different interpretations of it that like I said, I haven't studied, and I think a lot of the Vinaya texts haven't even been translated into languages that we can understand. So it is difficult to become a sort of Vinaya expert unless if you're studying in Sarah or one of the big monasteries and you know Tibetan, and you do the Vinaya class there, then you can go into details with all the various aspects of Vinaya. But then there are different Vinaya traditions. So how things are in the Mula Savastivada tradition, how they are in the Dharmaguptaka tradition, the Theravada tradition are not exactly the same. So I'm just curious, how many people did get ordained with Chado Rinpoche? It was just a few days ago.
9 Getsuls and Getsuls and 13 Leons.
9 Getsuls.
Yes, and 13 Leons.
13.
Yes.
And 9 Getsuls.
And Getsuls.
And Getsuls means both monks and nuns, or 9 altogether? 9 and 13. Wow. Wonderful. I rejoice.
You're living there at the Abbey. Have you lived in other monastic communities, and were they very different to where you are now?
Well, in the beginning, when I first got ordained, I lived at Kopan, and it was kind of a monastic community there. I lived there for 3 years. There were about, like I say, sometimes up to 20 people, but some people would come and go. Sometimes the number was smaller. And then in the early 1980s, I lived at Vajrayogini Institute. We had one area of the building that we called Dorje Pomo Monastery. And I was there for 2 years. Then Lama Zopa Rinpoche sent me to Australia. And I think that community continued for another 2 years, maybe. And then, various circumstances happened. It didn't continue. But now it's been reborn. I'm very happy to hear Dorje Pomo has been reborn. Then I lived at Lama Tsongkhapa Institute for 6 years. It wasn't really a monastery. We didn't really have a monastery there, although there were quite a few monastics. The monks had an area to themselves, but the nuns were kind of scattered. Some of us lived in the institute, some lived outside. We didn't have a place of our own, but we did try to meet together and have meetings on a regular basis. But it wasn't quite the same as a monastic community. So those are the only experiences that I've had of living in monastic communities. And in my limited experience, this one, Sravasti Abbey, is the best. I feel it has many, many advantages, many good qualities. I really like the way things are done here. But it's not easy. It's kind of tough. But there's a lot of joy, a lot of love, harmony. People do sometimes, have little problems with each other, but they work them out. They have ways of getting together, discussing and working them out. And the younger monastics have a mentor, one of the senior monastics who looks after them, meets with them regularly, helps them with their difficulties and guides them and so on. I think that's also very healthy. I remember trying to do that once. Oh yeah, that's right. I lived a couple of years in Manjushri Institute in England. That was in the early 80s. Again, it wasn't really a monastery, but we did have a large number of monastics, and we did meet together and try to do things together in a monastic way. So we did try that in those days. We tried having a buddy system where the younger ones had a senior one that was guiding them. But I think some of the younger ones weren't too happy about that arrangement. They didn't, I don't know, didn't like being guided. Didn't seem to feel the need for that. So sometimes that didn't work. But yeah, I think things here work pretty well. And yeah, I think a big advantage is just the existence of a large number of Western people who have been ordained for a number of years. And so we have experience that we can share with the younger ones. And what the younger ones often say, like, for example, myself coming here to this community, I often hear people express thanks. They're really happy that I'm here. They find it very inspiring and encouraging to have someone like myself who's from the same background, Western background, rather than Asian background, and having kept vows for so many years. So they find just having me here is very helpful for them. And like I say, in the early days, we didn't have that. There were Tibetan monks, but they were coming from a very different background, very different culture, society, worldview, language, everything. But we didn't have experienced Western monastics or even practitioners, people who had been practicing Buddhism for a number of years and, developed a strong practice. So yeah, I think that's one advantage nowadays. People coming into Buddhist monasticism have role models that they can look to and seek help from, seek guidance from, and so on. Well, if there are no more questions, I just wanted to read one thing in case you haven't come across this before. It's something written by His Holiness the Dalai Lama in 1973. And the title of it is The Joy of Monastic Discipline. I never came across this before, but it's in one of these volumes of books that Thupten Chudron is compiling. So it's mainly the teachings of His Holiness, and she's editing them. So far, I think 8 of these have been published. There's another one on its way and another one being written. They're called the Library of Wisdom and Compassion in English. So in volume 4 of that series, which is called Following in the Buddha's Footsteps, that particular volume has a lot about refuge, the 3 jewels, and the 3 higher trainings, ethics, concentration, and wisdom. So it's really a lot of amazing material in that book. So this particular little kind of a poem written by His Holiness is in there. So I just like to read it because I think it's very, very beautiful. And it's coming from our precious teacher, His Holiness the Dalai Lama. How appropriate it is for those fortunate to follow you, the Buddha who taught great purity, to engage with minds of faith in pure conduct beyond reproach. Externally pure and also internally pure. This is the Buddhist tradition. It produces every temporary and ultimate benefit How auspicious to meet with this medicine, benefiting both self and others. This opportunity is found this once, is difficult to find again, and those who strive are so few. Make firm effort in your heart and apply yourself to pure conduct in 100 ways. Since without a doubt such a path can easily subdue the very coarse afflictions, why even mention freeing from the dukkha experienced in the householder's life? With discipline as the root, what cannot be produced from the mighty tree of the Mahayana path, bodhicitta, and the union of calm abiding and insight. The extremely swift, ultimate secret path, the magnificent and praiseworthy method to transform strong poison into medicine, the foundation of this too is ethical discipline. Ema, cherish this discipline, which is the cause of attaining swiftly, the inseparable union of emptiness and compassion, the state of Vajradhara. Therefore, O friends with intelligence, do not disparage or hold as trivial the Pratimoksha ethical code which originates in the Shravaka's scriptures. Discipline is praised as the basis and root of the doctrine. One should strive to maintain it carefully by study and analysis, with mindfulness and introspective awareness. Guard it respectfully with conscientiousness and integrity. Do not be lazy or indifferent, lest you snap the root of lasting happiness. I have spoken these words with the thought to benefit, lest the purpose be diminished. By the kindness of the great Father Manjughosha and my kind and qualified spiritual mentors, this monk from Amdo, Tenzin Gyatso, has written this with heartfelt respect for these practices. Forsaking eloquence in composition, it was composed in a plain and simple style. By any merits it may have, may all mother sentient beings in general, and especially many intelligent young people from the land of snows, engage in the practice of this path and touch the ground of supreme awakening. May all good fortune increase. So I do hope this talk has been beneficial. And I really wish all of you the very best in your monastic life.
Thank you so much, Sangye Khadro, for being with us, sharing a lot of your experience. So, yeah, I think everyone can relate to a lot what you say, and we can add to it, like, yeah, to our, with your experience, we can add to our experience. So, thank you so much for sharing. Would you like to end like with a dedication or final meditation?
Yeah, we can mentally dedicate the merit of this session. So we started off with prayers, with positive, altruistic motivation, wanting to benefit all living beings, wanting to develop our potential for enlightenment, fulfilling that potential, becoming a fully enlightened Buddha so that we can benefit all living beings, and keeping monastic vows. Living as a monastic, monk or nun, is the most excellent way of living our life to create the causes for enlightenment and benefit all living beings. So extremely fortunate that we have this opportunity to meet the Buddha's teachings and be interested in the Buddha's teachings and be interested in following this path and even dedicating our lives to it by keeping monastic vows. So So all this merit, the merit from this session and all the merit from taking and keeping the monastic vows. So let's gather together all that merit mentally and then dedicate it to the enlightenment of all living beings who have all been our kind mothers and fathers and have helped us in countless ways in all our previous lives. And they will continue helping us all the way to enlightenment. We actually can't achieve enlightenment without sentient beings. We need them as objects of our love, our compassion, our bodhicitta, a practice of patience and generosity and ethics, and so on. So we are totally dependent on other living beings. So it's only right that we repay their kindness, and the best way of repaying their kindness is developing our potential for enlightenment, becoming enlightened as quickly as we can, so that we can lead them all out of samsara, lead them all to enlightenment as well, and help them in whatever way we can between now and enlightenment. Let's dedicate all this merit to bring about these positive altruistic aspirations. And let's also dedicate to the long lives of all our precious spiritual teachers, His Holiness the Dalai Lama, Chado Rinpoche, all the other teachers, Geshis, Lamas, Western teachers, and so on, from whom we have learned the Dharma and continue relying on. And also for the quick return of those teachers who have passed away, such as Lama Zopa Rinpoche. May his reincarnation appear as quickly as possible and continue his incredible work to benefit the Dharma and sentient beings. And let's also dedicate the merit that all of us will be able to remain ordained, keeping vows until the end of this life and in all our future lives as well, until we reach enlightenment.